Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at something incredibly difficult, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It's a situation that, well, some are calling a stain on human history. That's a direct quote from officials and advocates cited in the materials.
It's a really heavy topic, no doubt about it. And it touches on so much international law, politics, just basic humanity. The sources you send over, they paint a very vivid and disturbing picture.
They really do. And that's our mission today, to do a focused deep dive into those sources. We've got UN reports, human rights analyses, media commentary, the whole range.
Right. And the idea is to pull out the key perspectives, the findings, the claims being made in those materials for you.
Exactly. We want to give you a clear understanding of what these sources are saying about this incredibly complex situation. We're here to relay that information, not push any specific viewpoint ourselves.
Yeah, the goal is really for you to walk away better informed, to have a clearer sense of not just what is happening, but maybe why, according to these reports, and how the world is responding or not responding.
And maybe find some connections or insights that aren't immediately obvious, some aha moments perhaps, drawn directly from the analysis provided.
Definitely. So where should we start? The human cost seems like the unavoidable beginning point.
I agree. To really get a sense of the scale, the sources are just devastating. We're talking over a year and a half since October 2023, and the figures cited over 60,000 civilian deaths by July 2025.
60,000. It's hard to even picture.
And the detail that just leaps out from the reports is that the vast majority are women and children.
Yeah, that's consistently highlighted. Plus over 1 million displaced, homeless.
Over 1 million. The human cost is just, it's almost beyond comprehension.
And it's not just the immediate violence, is it? The sources talk extensively about this massive hunger crisis that's unfolded.
Right. The UN reports use terms like catastrophic hunger for over half the population.
Catastrophic. And in the north, tens of thousands on the actual brink of famine.
Well, and the reports are very clear. This isn't just some tragic side effect of war. They suggest it's, well, a systematic outcome.
A systematic outcome. That's a chilling phrase. Can you elaborate on what the sources mean by that?
Well, they detail how Israel's comprehensive blockade cut off the essentials, food, clean water, electricity, fuel, and how basic infrastructure was systematically destroyed.
I remember reading the accounts. People forced to eat animal feed, weeds, grass, just to survive. It's hard to imagine that level of desperation.
Exactly. And the UN Human Rights High Commissioner is quoted directly attributing the famine to Israel's blockade and the prevention of aid. It's framed as a direct consequence, not an accident.
So the sources are really pointing to intentionality there, which I suppose brings us to those historical comparisons you mentioned earlier.
It does. The reports note the first hunger-related deaths were back in January 2024. By July 2025, at least 147 confirmed civilian deaths from starvation, including 88 children.
88 children.
And when you put that alongside historical events mentioned in the analyses, like the siege of Leningrad, nearly 1 million deaths from starvation used as a tactic.
Or the Holodomor in Ukraine, 3.5 to 5 million lives lost in a man-made famine.
Or even more recently, Yemen. Since 2015, something like 85,000 children, over 100,000 adults dead from hunger in that conflict.
So the sources draw these lines to really underscore the severity, the gravity of what's described in Gaza. It has these dark historical echoes.
It does. And that leads to this phrase that appears in the materials, famine as a weapon.
Right. And the IPC hunger phases, that's the international standard, isn't it?
Yes. And Gaza reaching phase 5, catastrophe famine, the point where, quote, mass deaths begin.
It's within that framework that you see this incredibly stark claim emerging in the sources that hunger is the new name for genocide in Gaza.
Which is an extremely powerful claim. What's the legal argument behind that, according to the human rights groups cited?
Well, organizations like Amnesty International and even some Israeli human rights groups cited in the materials argue that a conscious policy of starving civilians amounts to a war crime.
Okay.
And potentially a crime against humanity. And they argue further that it can legally meet the definition of genocide if starvation is used with the specific intent to destroy a group, in whole or in part. That intent is the crucial element in the legal definition.
And the evidence for that intent?
The reports point to things like the systematic destruction of agriculture, which Medico International's representative highlighted, and the aid flow figures we discussed, needing 600 trucks a day, getting sometimes single digits.
Extremely few was the phrase used.
Exactly. These organizations argue that this pattern points towards a deliberate policy, not just neglect or collateral damage.
So if the sources point to a deliberate policy causing famine, the next logical question is about responsibility. How do these international organizations assign it?
Pretty unequivocally, based on the documents. They identify Israel as the culprit, to use the term found in some reports, because of the blockade and the obstruction of aid.
And it goes back to that total siege declaration in October 2023.
Yes. The sources emphasize that declaration cutting off water, electricity, fuel, halting food and medicine was presented as an explicit policy. Some analyses frame it as collective punishment.
And the aid numbers you mentioned earlier really drive that home. From 500, 600 trucks a day pre-war down to an average of maybe 70 a day between May and July 2025, according to the World Food Program.
And sometimes much lower, like those figures of around 12 trucks a day in February 2024.
The UN said at times only 5% of needed aid was getting through.
And it gets even worse. The sources detail Israeli forces actually targeting aid distribution points.
That part was deeply disturbing to read. At least 1,000 civilians killed just waiting for aid by May 2025.
Yes, according to those reports. It suggests targeting the most vulnerable, those desperately seeking sustenance. It goes beyond simple obstruction.
And the intent isn't just inferred by outside groups. The sources quote Israeli leaders directly.
Netanyahu talking about harsh measures to force Hamas to surrender.
But even more stark was that quote from Defense Minister Yoav Gallant back in October 2023.
The Gazans will live like animals. Quote. Yes, that's highlighted in several analyses.
What are the implications of statements like that, according to the legal analyses?
Well, the sources argue these aren't just throwaway lines. They indicate the deliberate nature of the policy, this kind of intimidation strategy against an entire population, 2.3 million people. It's described as potentially constituting a crime against humanity under international law.
Explicitly prohibited by the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute, which establishes the ICC.
Exactly. The sources suggest these statements offer a window into the intent behind the blockade.
Okay, so that's the situation on the ground and the alleged intent behind it. What about the international response? The sources seem to paint a picture of, well, failure, a crisis of credibility.
That's a recurring theme, yes, especially regarding the UN Security Council.
Paralyzed by vetoes.
Consistently, according to the reports. The U.S. vetoing resolutions for a humanitarian ceasefire for lifting the blockade. That June 2025 vote is a stark example. 14 votes in favor, 1 U.S. veto.
And other members saying the U.S. was in a parallel universe.
Right. And while the General Assembly did pass a ceasefire resolution back in November 2023...
120 to 14, I recall.
A huge majority, yes. But General Assembly resolutions are non-binding, so symbolic, perhaps, but not practically effective in changing the situation on the ground.
So the Security Council is blocked, the General Assembly lacks teeth. What about other bodies, like the International Criminal Court?
The ICC has jurisdiction, the sources confirm that. But progress has been stalled, reportedly due to non-cooperation from Israel and its key supporters. Similarly, UN Human Rights Council reports issue condemnations but struggle to translate into concrete action.
Which leads to that double standard criticism you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The sources frequently contrast the swift, severe sanctions against Russia over Ukraine with the lack of concrete measures regarding Gaza, despite allegations of similar or worse violations. This inconsistency, many argue, badly damages the UN's credibility.
And you see the impact on agencies trying to work there. UNRWA running out of supplies.
Operations nearly halting. The World Food Program warning of famine, but the UN system itself struggling to make a formal declaration because of, well, bureaucratic hurdles.
And UNICEF highlighting grave violations against children. That 2024 UN report had some shocking findings.
It did, listing Israeli forces as the top perpetrator of harm to children globally for that period, over 7,000 incidents, over 1,200 children killed between October 23 and June 24.
Yet, Israel wasn't formally blacklisted by the UN.
Correct. Despite those figures, Israel wasn't added to the formal UN list of parties committing grave violations against children, which, as the sources note, drew significant criticism.
Amidst all this inaction, though, the sources point to a potentially significant shift, diplomatically speaking, particularly in Europe.
Yes, this is quite a development. The reports highlight a real shift, seemingly driven by the sheer scale of the catastrophe in Gaza. You have French President Macron announcing in July 2025 France's intention to formally recognize Palestine by September 2025.
Which would be huge, right? A permanent UN Security Council member doing that.
Absolutely, the first P5 member in nearly 30 years. And then you have the UK's Prime Minister Starmer and Canada's Prime Minister Carney signaling similar moves. It suggests a major break from the previous consensus, particularly from the US line.
Is it just about the morality of the situation, or are there strategic calculations here, according to the analyses?
It seems to be both. The sources suggest several underlying motivations. Yes, moral concerns and public pressure are factors, but also potentially a desire to refresh their global image, reduce diplomatic reliance on the U.S., maybe gain influence in the Middle East and the Global South, and even try to prevent further radicalization. It's complex.
Unsurprisingly, the reaction from Israel, as reported, was furious, Netanyahu calling it rewarding terror.
Yes, and a launching pad for Israel's destruction. Very strong language.
And the U.S. response under the Trump administration.
Equally strong, just in the opposite direction. Secretary of State Rubio reportedly called the moves reckless, serving Hamas propaganda. And there were even reports of Trump threatening Canada with trade repercussions.
It really highlights the growing isolation of the U.S. position on this specific issue. If 142 countries recognize Palestine by 2024-25, and France and the UK join,
then the U.S. becomes even more of an outlier among major global powers, especially within the Security Council, on the question of Palestinian statehood.
Now, Germany's position is presented as particularly complex in the sources. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, Germany's situation is unique because of its history, the Holocaust. There's been this long-standing, deeply felt responsibility for Israel's security, often leading to caution and criticism. Former Chancellor Scholz emphasized this back in October 2023.
But things seem to have shifted, even there. The new chancellor, Merz, taking office in May 2025.
Right. He actually publicly criticized Netanyahu, according to the reports, said Israel was exceeding limits, violating international humanitarian law, and that he didn't understand the military objectives anymore. That's a significant shift in rhetoric for a German chancellor.
And what about public opinion in Germany?
Quite striking. Polls cited in the sources suggest 73% of Germans believe Israel's actions in Gaza fit the definition of genocide.
73%.
Wow. And you have groups like Amnesty Germany and, again, even Israeli human rights organizations echoing these concerns, sometimes drawing comparisons to Bosnia.
But despite all that, Germany's official policy remains cautious.
It seems so. The sources suggest fears of anti-Semitism accusations, domestic political fallout, especially from the far right, are holding them back from stronger actions. They've slowed arms shipments, apparently, but not halted them entirely, and resisted tougher EU measures. It's described as a real moral dilemma.
Which brings us squarely to the United States. The sources consistently portray the U.S. as Israel's staunchest ally. Why is that commitment so deep?
Several reasons are highlighted. Geopolitically, Israel is seen as a critical ally against rivals like Iran. Ideologically, a democratic partner. There's the counterterrorism angle. And crucially, the sources emphasize the powerful influence of the pro-Israel lobby in U.S. politics, plus near unconditional bipartisan support in Congress.
And the evangelical Christian base is mentioned as a key factor, too, especially on the Republican side.
Yes, that's cited as a significant driver of support.
And this support seems consistent across different administrations. Biden post-October 7th.
Pledged unwavering support pushed through rapid military aid. His comments dismissing civilian deaths as the cost of war are cited, often contrasted with his language on Ukraine.
And then Trump's re-election in 2024.
The sources suggest support for Israel became even more of an ideological pillar, with humanitarian concerns largely downplayed by his administration.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of the U.S. military aid during this period?
It's substantial. Billions of dollars between October 2023 and July 2025. The reports mention things like a $14 billion package for Iron Dome munitions, another $2.5 billion for howitzer ammo, large bombs like the Mk-84s.
And even under Trump in early 2025, more transfers.
Yes, $3 billion for JDAM guidance kits, explosives. It's described as a continuous, massive pipeline of military hardware.
The sources really stress the global perception this creates, that idea that if you're a U.S. ally, you can violate international law.
Yeah.
How is that playing out?
It's seen as deeply damaging. Countries like China and Russia, according to commentators cited, readily point to this perceived hypocrisy to deflect criticism of their own actions. It fuels cynicism about Western claims of upholding a rules-based order.
And the bottom line, according to these analyses, is that Israel feels empowered to act as it does, largely because of this U.S. backing.
That's the strong suggestion, that without significant pressure from Washington, major policy changes are unlikely.
So considering all these factors, the devastation, the blockade, the international paralysis, the U.S. support, what do the sources say about the future of Gaza?
Well, the picture painted regarding Israeli intentions is quite stark. Netanyahu's government hinting at permanent control, possibly de facto annexation.
There were those leaked plans from July 2025?
Yes, suggesting annexing northern Gaza as a buffer zone, setting up some kind of demilitarized Palestinian authority in the south if Hamas rejects proposals. These are presented as serious considerations within the Israeli government.
And legally, annexation is.
Completely illegal under international law. That's unambiguous. And the sources draw that powerful comparison again. Russia annexes Crimea, gets hit with severe sanctions. Israel hints at annexing Gaza, and the international response is comparatively weak.
Those two parallel universes again.
Exactly. And even though the U.S. officially says no annexation, its practical willingness to prevent it seems unclear based on the analyses. Meanwhile, Egypt keeps its border largely closed, fearing a refugee crisis. So Gaza remains trapped, potentially as this permanent open-air prison.
It sounds incredibly bleak. Are there any signs of hope mentioned in the sources? Any positive developments?
There are some flickers. One is the growing global public pressure we talked about.
The protests, social media awareness, especially among younger people.
The BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions reportedly gaining momentum. Countries like South Africa, Namibia, Bolivia using terms like apartheid regime officially. And that big UN General Assembly vote showing a clear moral consensus, even if non-binding.
What about diplomatic tracks?
There's mention of a planned conference on peaceful resolution of Palestinian question for summer 2025 in New York, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia. The hope is it could create a roadmap for a two-state solution, maybe secure reconstruction funds.
And the ICC investigation.
The prosecutor is reportedly aiming to wrap up preliminary investigations by the end of 2025. That could potentially lead to actual charges, arrest warrants for war crimes. Similar to what happened after the Yugoslav wars, that would be a major step.
And you mentioned the General Assembly, but potentially using the Uniting for Peace mechanism.
Yes, it's a possibility raised in some analyses, a way for the GA to recommend action, like maybe an international sea aid corridor if the Security Council remains deadlocked. It's a long shot, perhaps, but a potential avenue.
When you think about past international actions, the Tribunal for Yugoslavia, NATO in Libya to protect civilians.
Right. The ICTY charging figures like Milosevic and Mladic with genocide, UN Security Council Resolution 1973 authorizing intervention in Libya.
It really forces the question, doesn't it? The question posed implicitly and sometimes explicitly in the sources. Why is Gaza different? Why no similar robust intervention, no sanctions coalition, no effective UN action against acts labeled as war crimes or even genocide by reputable groups?
It's the core question hanging over this entire situation, challenging the consistency and effectiveness of the international system itself.
And the stakes are incredibly high. The sources warn that if annexation or ethnic cleansing is allowed to happen, even tacitly,
it won't just stay in Gaza. It risks destabilizing the whole region, killing off any hope for peace, and fueling extremism for generations. Preventing that outcome is presented not just as a moral issue, but a fundamental strategic imperative.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. A deep dive into the devastating reality described in Gaza, the often confusing and contradictory international responses, and the huge moral and legal questions this raises.
It really forces a confrontation with some uncomfortable truths about how the world works or doesn't work.
And maybe a final thought to leave you, our listener, with drawn from reflecting on all this material. Is the Gazan crisis just a distant tragedy? Or is it, as some sources suggest, a mirror showing us the cracks in the global system? What does it tell us about the real power of international law, about the meaning of never again, depending on where in the world events unfold?
It's something to really consider. How does this shape your understanding of global justice, of international relations going forward? We hope this exploration of the source material has given you some clarity and perhaps even more questions to pursue.
Continue to seek out information, to analyze, to engage critically with what's happening in the world. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.